Hello, my name is Mary Buelow, and I'm one of the librarians here at the Hedberg Public Library. I'm also on Janesville's Complete Count Committee for the 2020 census. The Complete Count Committee is made up of individuals in the community representing government, nonprofits, businesses, and community activists, and our purpose is to spread the word about the 2020 census, which for me is not hard. The census is a vital part of my work. I work with people on a regular basis looking for information in the historic censuses, 1940 and before. They're looking for family history information. And I love helping them through that because those old census informations, they give us a view of our history and little snapshots of time of every 10 years. And it's very exciting for me. The modern census is interesting as well because that's a snapshot of who we are today. With the modern census, we only see the statistics, but those statistics help us organize our resources, organize governance, and plan for our future. So right now, it's time for our 2020 census. And why we count, that's actually in our Constitution. And it's not buried somewhere down in the bottom of the Constitution in one of the amendments. It's right up front. Article 1, Section 2. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their representative numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. And what we do with those numbers is we use them to determine where who is represented by how many Congress people. So there are 435 representatives to Congress, and those are distributed among the 50 states based on the population of each state. So this map right here shows the changes from the 2010 census. Some states, the ones in blue, they gained population and they gained representatives. And however, since the number of representatives is fixed at 435, if some states gain representation, others will lose representation. And those are the ones in orange. And then after the reapportionment happens, where it is determined how many congressmen and women will represent us from each state for the next 10 years, each state goes through and draws lines as to where those districts are. If you take a look down in the lower right-hand corner of the state, down around where Milwaukee is, you can see District 4 is very, very small. Whereas District 7, which is that northern third of the state, is a very large geography. Both of those cover the same number of people. So that is the point of apportioning our population by, our representation by population, is that each district, each representative represents the same number of people, so that when those representatives go to Congress, each person in those districts has the same voice. And we have been doing this every year since the beginning of our country. Our first census was in 1790. So they passed the Constitution that was ratified in 1789. Congress held their first session, and one of the laws that they passed in that first session was the first census. So in the first census, 16 US Marshals conducted the entire 1790 census. It took them 18 months. And they rode, horseback mostly. Remember, there were no real roads at that point, not many in this country. And they covered the original 13 states, plus the districts of Kentucky, Maine, and Vermont. And what was then known as the Southwest Territory, we know it as the state of Tennessee. So in that first census, they came back with a population of 3,929,214. President George Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson were a little disappointed. They'd hoped for higher numbers. One of the things that they pushed for that first census, besides reapportionment, was to give a strong showing of this country so that Britain would not want to ever attack us again. So they were a little disappointed, but 3.9 million was what we had. In those early census, actually those marshals, they were very careful to be accurate. They would go and when they were riding around the countryside, they would find public places and they would post the census for that area so people could double check and make sure they got it right. So 3,929,214. And in years later, they added more questions each year. James Madison suggested that the census takers add these additional questions because it would better help lawmakers understand the needs of the nation. So in 1810, they added questions about manufacturers. In 1820, they asked if persons, well, they specified white persons, aged 20 years and older, if they could read and write. 1830, questions about employment were added. 1830 was also the year the Census Office, it wasn't a department yet, it was an office. They started supplying the first printed questionnaires. Before that time, all those guys who were riding around the countryside with their horses and posting up their lists on, in local public places, they were using whatever paper they could find and their own writing implements. So by 1830, there was actually a questionnaire that they filled out. And by 1840, we'd gotten up to a population of 17 million. So in 50 years, we'd grown from 3.9 to 17 million in our country. 1850, we started to see some really big changes in the census that year. So not only did they give out actual questionnaires for what they called enumerators now, the people who counted, they not only gave out questionnaires for them to fill out, they actually gave uniform instructions for them. They had by now long stopped posting the information into public places. And they printed not the names, but they printed the numbers in the local newspapers when they got their results. 1850, for my people who are looking for family history information, was also the first year that everyone was listed individually. 1790, they only listed the name of the head of the family, and after that, they were listing individuals just by head count, whether they were male, whether they were female, if the males were under age 16 or over 16, if they were free or not free. But in 1850, that was the first time women had their names listed in the census. It was the first time children had their names listed in the census. They started listing everybody. For the people who were not free, who were enslaved, they were not listed independently, unfortunately. They were listed by owner. So for people who are looking for family history in this time period, if their ancestors were enslaved, it is tricky to find them because you have to find the owner in order to find your family. Other questions they started to ask in 1850 were exact age and place of birth. 1860, 1870, there weren't a whole lot of changes, but we are still doing the census every 10 years. By 1880, people got curious about where people were from, where they were moving from and to within our country. So in 1880, they were asking where our parents were born. And if they were born in the United States, they would list the state. Otherwise, they would list the country. In 1880, we were also becoming a more urban society. And so for people who lived inside cities, they listed addresses for city residents. They also were starting to look at information about the workforce, whether or not people were able to work. So they asked if someone was sick or disabled. And how it was phrased is, on the day the enumerator came to visit, they would ask if they were able to, so sick or disabled so as to be unable to attend to ordinary business or duties. If so, was it a sickness or a disability? And then they would proceed to ask how disabled. 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, as you can see, the map is filling in. We now have, by 1920, we have all 48 states of the continental United States in place. 1920, we were up to a population of 106 million and some change. We continue to grow as a country. In 1890, people were being asked if they were foreign-born or naturalized or taken naturalization papers out. If you remember your history, that was the first big time where there was a whole big question about whether someone was a natural-born citizen or naturalized. In 1910, they asked questions about the mother tongue, what language you spoke when you were a child. They also asked more and more questions about employment and unemployment. Then in 1930, employment and unemployment was the big issue. So they did have the regular census questionnaire for everybody, as they always had done. And then in 1930, enumerators were supposed to pull out a whole second questionnaire. So you had the census, and you had a census of employment. So they were trying to figure out if people were actually at work. And people would often say they were at work, but were they really? So they asked, how many days did they work this last week? If they were out of a job, how many weeks have they been out of a job? The reason for being out of a job. And they would be very specific about it, whether the plant was closed down, whether it was off-season, whether someone was sick, whether there was a strike, machines were introduced, whatever the reason was, they wrote it down. So in 1930, they had this whole second census of employment. 1940, they didn't do that, but they were concerned. They'd gotten a lot of people back to work, but they knew that a lot of people didn't have a whole lot of money to maintain their housing, and they were concerned about the status of the housing stock. So in addition to the census in 1940, they asked a separate housing census. That was looking at things like the condition of the building that you lived in, whether it was rented or owned, what was the value of it, how it was heated, lighting, the water supply, and the famous toilet question. If you've heard anything about the census, sooner or later someone will say, oh, and they ask you how many toilets that you have. Well, they don't always ask that all the time, but that originated in this 1940 housing census. And in that, they would ask if it was a flush toilet and whether it was in the structure, whether it was your own toilet or if you shared it with another household, if it was a non-flush flush toilet, if it was inside, or if it was an outside toilet or privy, or if you had no toilet or privy whatsoever. So they did this whole housing census to get idea of what was the status of this country's housing stock. 1940 was also notable for another reason. This was the first year they did something called short form, long form. So they were finding that with all these additional questions and these additional censuses, that people were getting more and more reluctant to answer so many intrusive questions into their life, no matter how important it was for the functioning of government. So what they decided, the core of the census is back to that reapportionment. Identifying everybody in the country and counting them once and only once and in the right place. But they had gotten used to all this data that they had gotten from all these other questions, and people were using it for all kinds of other things. But that other data didn't need to count every single person. They could do a statistical sample, and it would be just as good. So they broke up the census questions into a short form, which everyone answered, and a long form, which only 5% of the population answered. And that short form, long form format carried through 1950 and into 1960 and throughout subsequent decades into the 21st, up through the end of the 20th century. 1960 was the next big innovation. It took a lot of time to send enumerators out to every single household. And if you notice, the numbers keep on going up and up and up. And by 1960, we had a population of 179 million. So long way away from that original 3.9 million. So in 1960, what they did is they started to experiment with census by mail. Urban residents, if you lived inside a city, received your questionnaire in the mail. And then they would fill out the questionnaire themselves, no help of the enumerator. Then what they would do is they would put that questionnaire in a special envelope, put it by the side of the door, and wait for the enumerators to come by. All the enumerators had to do was pick up the envelope and take it back to the office, and then where they could tally the results. In the rural areas, they did still send the enumerators out to every single household. But that census by mail was, first experiment was successful enough that in 1970, they went to the first true mail-out, mail-back system. So the census mailed your questionnaire to your home. The householder filled it out, put it in the return envelope, and mailed it back. And most people responded to the census that way. They did check for any stragglers, people who had not responded, and they sent the enumerators out to those households only to people who did not respond to their paper census in the mail. And that is what happened through the end of the 20th century into the Census 2000. And then we had our next big innovation in 2005. So if you notice, this is not an on-year, a decade census, it's an off-year. What they're doing here is they're saying, we need to do the head count, the actual head count every 10 years, but all these other questions that we were asking, the long form questions that we're using for statistical purposes that are not required in the Constitution, we are going to split those out. So in 2005, they took all those questions that would have gone into the long form and turned it into something called the American Community Survey. So this was designed to completely replace that long form, and it was sent to a sample of addresses in 2005 of about 3.5 million addresses in the 50 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. And they were asked about those types of questions that used to be on the long form that would not be as important for that 10-year census. And they were able to get the results back and be able to use them for all those purposes that had not been required in the Constitution that people were using the census for. It's things like planning and business sites and other things that we'll talk about a little later. And they have been doing this American Community Survey every year ever since. So not only is it separated from the census, the 10-year census, it is more up to date because it is done every year. And because it is separated out, it makes the 10-year census so much simpler. So in 2010, everyone got the short form only. Long form is gone. And it was advertised as 10 minutes to answer 10 questions. And it was quick, people were done, and again, enumerators only had to go to households where people did not respond by the mail-in. Which brings us up to the 2020 census, which has its own new innovations. But the purpose is the same. We want to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. So we want to count them for that reapportionment, but we also want to count them because there are, as I mentioned, some other things that have snuck in over time that people use the census for. One of those things is distribution of funds. So over the years, Congress has passed a whole bunch of bills that for funding different programs. They wanted to ensure that those funds were distributed equitably based on population. And so they tied distribution of those funds to the census. And there have been people who sat down, done calculations based on appropriations, different programs, and figured out that for about just looking at 325 federal programs that are where the funds are distributed based on data from the census, they are used to distribute over $675 billion. And some examples of that are Medicaid and S-CHIP, so healthcare programs for our populations who cannot afford healthcare in any other way. Healthcare centers for all of us, where they should be cited if they get any special grants. Dislocated worker assistance. That was very big for Janesville after the GM plant closed. We got a lot of funds from dislocated worker assistance, and the amount of funds that we got was based on our census numbers. Highway planning and construction, where the roads go, where funds go for mass transit, where funds go for substance abuse. There are so many different programs where the money is tied to the census numbers. And another program called Counting for Dollars that is organized by the George Washington University of Public Policy, sat down and looked at numbers for only 55 federal programs, but they were trying to figure out state by state, just for one fiscal year, for 2016, how much money went to each state. In Wisconsin in 2016, just for those 55 federal programs, Wisconsin received $12,608,476,954 in that year. That was our tax money that we here in Wisconsin paid to the federal government, and they gave back to us based on our census numbers. It's estimated, well, their estimates vary, but it is estimated that for every person who is missed in the census, there will be funds lost to that community. And for those who are thinking, well, I'm not really sure I want the federal government to be paying for all those programs anyway, that's Congress's decision. Congress decides the size of the pie. They decide how much will be allocated. The census does not determine the size of the pie. It determines the size of each slice and where it goes. So, for every person who is missed, our slice is just a little bit smaller. Another reason why we count is just for that information. So data is very helpful for making decisions. If we don't know how many people we have, or how many children will be going into school in 5 years, if we don't know how many elderly we have and how much healthcare resources they need, it's very hard for us to make plans for the future. Businesses need to make plans. They make plans on where to site locations for their factories, their retail outlets, their distribution centers. An example here in Janesville is that Dollar General distribution center south of town. So when Dollar General back in 2014, 2015 was looking for a place to try and to site a new distribution center, they had choices of several communities. And each community was giving options for tax incentives, for other benefits, for reduced price land, all kinds of things to try and lure Dollar General to their community. Why they chose Janesville? They looked at the census numbers and saw that we have a workforce here. We have able-bodied people who, when Dollar General was ready to open the doors, put up help wanted signs, people would show up. That was important to them. They needed those bodies, and so they came to Janesville. Transportation is another big issue. So we have been struggling for years here in Janesville with the 4 lanes, 2 lanes in each direction of I-90. It's been very congested from the state line all the way up to Madison, as people are trying to fight for space in the roadway among all the trucks. And the census numbers actually helped to persuade decision makers that we needed to expand that highway. And for those who would like to see this all done by nonprofits and by charities and to have less from the federal government, please keep in mind that those nonprofits and charities, they apply for grants. Wherever they apply for grants from, they use census data to persuade the grant givers that the need really is there. So data is also used to enforce laws and regulations and policies against discrimination. So for those communities that say if they're 80% African American, but their police department, there's no African Americans, any reasonable person can look and say, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and want to look deeper into why that happened. Data informs us about our communities so we can spot trends, we can spot problems, we can spot possibilities. How the information is not used. This is from the U.S. Code, Title 13, Section 7, subsection C. In no case shall information furnished under this section, under the Census Law, Title 13, be used to the detriment of any respondent or other person to whom this relates. So participating in the census, putting your family members, your household members down for the census is not going to haunt you. The census will not share this information with anyone. They won't share it with the police. They will not share it with your landlord or with ICE, child welfare, anybody else. The census is confidential. So I have commented that people, when they are missed, we lose a little bit of funding each time. And we do know that there are communities that regularly are missed in the census. Looking back at 2010, one of the biggest categories of people who were missed were children under the age of 5. People said, well, you said to count everyone in the household, but I didn't think you meant the baby. Well, we do count the baby. We need to count the baby because if they're not counted as a baby, they're not accounted for the first 10 years of their life. So for the first 10 years, we don't know they're there for planning purposes, for school districts, for services. We don't have that funding for that child for things like school lunches or other programs that they may need to take advantage of. So children are often undercounted. And the Complete Count Committee really does want to make sure we count every child in Janesville. We also know that young householders are undercounted. So if you think about it, if someone's 25, 26 years old, 10 years ago they were in high school. Their parents took care of all of this and they were out having fun or studying for doing their homework, studying for midterms, whatever it was that they were doing in high school. Now they are in their own household and they get this census thing in the mail. They might not know what it is. They might set it aside. It might get thrown out with the junk mail. We need young householders to know how important this is and how important it is to watch for the census and to be counted. Households with low incomes are often undercounted because households with low income, the adults are busy. They might have 2 jobs. They might just be job hunting. They are struggling to put food on the table and pay for the rent. The census form might get buried in with those unpaid bills. We need households with low incomes. It's essential that you take the time to go through and find that census form and respond. Renters are often missed for several reasons. One is, if you're looking at one of those old Victorians over in the 4th Ward, can you tell how many units are in that building? Is it 4? Is it 7? 6? 9? The Census Department has tried to figure out how many rental units there are. They were around in the 4th Ward last summer trying to identify exactly how many units and build an address list, but they may have missed one. The other thing with renters, if it's a security locked building and someone is missed in the census, the enumerator can only get in if the property manager lets them. So renters are often missed. Minorities are often missed, partly because some of them are low income, some are renters, a lot of minority children are missed, but also there is concern, particularly this time around in the 2020 census, about why the government is asking. Last year, there was a question whether we were going to include a citizenship question in the census. There is no citizenship question. That was eliminated. The Supreme Court said no. The forms were printed without the citizenship question. It's not there. But many people don't know that yet. They heard the news about the question. They didn't hear the news that it was canceled. So there is some concern about people, and we need to let people know that it is safe to do the census and the information will be confidential. And no, we're not asking about citizenship. Immigrants of any nationality actually are often missed because different countries do census differently. Some countries don't do a census at all. Others, they shut down the entire country for 24 hours and nobody goes anywhere. Everyone's on lockdown, just 24 hours, while the school teachers, who suddenly have turned into enumerators, go around and knock on everyone's door and do the head count. If you're used to that kind of census, it's easy to miss. Just another envelope that comes in the mail. Senior citizens, people with disabilities, they are sometimes in living situations where they are not the primary householder. Now, if they're in group quarters, like assisted living or a nursing home, they are counted as part of their group quarters. But if they're staying with family, if they're staying in some other situation, and that family, that household forgets to count them, then they can get missed. The homeless also can get missed very easily, because since we do so much notifying of the census by mail, it does require people to have a physical address. If you don't have a home, there's no physical address. So for all these populations to be counted, we need to find other ways to get the word out. And it is important for people to know that this is confidential, but that works both ways. So there is a firewall between the census and all other federal data. Only census data can be used for funding decisions. Even if someone is already involved in other government programs such as Medicare or Food Share or Section 8, or they just file their taxes. I've heard people say, they have my tax form, they have my information, no problem. The census cannot pull data from other departments. They cannot use that to infill their census data. And that data cannot be used for funding decision or reapportionment decisions. You must fill out the census form to be counted. So, with the 2020 census, the census already has begun. It actually started January 21st in Southwest Alaska's Tooksuk Bay, and it started early in Alaska because there's a lot of communities in Alaska that once the snow melts, the only way in and out is by airplane. They get their food by airplane, all their travels by airplane, all their mails by airplane. So they did their best to get to all these communities before the snow melted, when they could send enumerators out to these places that don't have good mail service, forget internet. And they could send them out on dog sleds, snowmobiles, whatever snow machine they could find, and go out and start the count. For the rest of us, the count officially started last week, March 12th. We are in what's called the self-response period. So households will receive a postcard in the mail. Some households in Janesville have already received them. Some, those postcards are on their way. And that postcard will have instructions on how to respond. And what is really new this year is in 2020, they're encouraging responses online. This is our first online census. So if you want, you open up your mailbox, you get your postcard, you can whip out your phone, go to 2020census.gov and do the census, submit your census responses right on the spot. For people who do not have internet, there is also a toll-free phone number, 1-844-330-2020, as in 2020 census. There are other phone numbers for other languages, and there will be a slide with those phone numbers, the English language phone number and all the other languages offered at the end of this presentation. So respondents can go to 2020census.gov or call 1-844-330-2020 toll-free to access and complete the census questionnaire. If you don't respond for whatever reason by April 8th, paper questionnaires will be mailed to homes that have not yet responded. And May 13th, that's when the enumerates go out and knock on the door. And I am sure hoping that we will all be out and back to our normal lives by then. But just in case, I certainly am going to try and get my census done in the self-reporting period because I really don't want strangers knocking on my door during a COVID epidemic. And the census really is quite easy. It is required by law, but it doesn't take too much time. For each household, there are 4 questions. How many people are living or staying in your home April 1st? Are there additional people staying in your home April 1st, in addition to the ones who live there permanently? Is this an apartment, home, house, or mobile home? And what's your telephone number? The telephone number is only if they have questions. So each household gets those 4 questions, and then there are 5 additional questions for each person in that household. Name, gender, age on April 1st, and their date of birth, and what their race is, Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. So if it's a single person household, they have 5 questions for the individual, 4 questions for the household, 9 questions total. For a household of 3 people, it's 3 times 5, 15, plus 4, total of 19 questions. They're all short and easy. And so if there's a language barrier, the paper forms are available in English and Spanish. Online response, there's 39 language options. Telephone, 13 languages, as well as TDY options for persons who are deaf. Persons who are deaf can also request a visit from a census taker who uses American Sign Language. So what we all need to do at this point is make a plan. Make a plan to respond to the census. Decide which method you're going to be using. Will it be the online form, the telephone, a paper form, or are you going to wait for the knock on the door? If you're in a multi-generational household, be sure to count everyone from the oldest to the youngest. If someone in the household is pregnant, now in that case you might want to wait until April 1st because all babies born April 1st and before need to be counted. For all the children, make a plan who's going to count the kids. If it's a 2-parent household, kids living there, that's easy. Blended family, joint custody, talk and figure out with the other parent who will count. There are various rules about if it's joint custody as to how long a child spends at one home versus another, or whether you should just pick April 1st, which is the official census day, to decide which household. But you want to figure that out. If there's other children living with you, even temporarily, such as foster children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, children of friends, we want to make sure that they are all counted. Any child that's not counted in the 2020 census is not accounted for in the first 10 years of their life. If it's a multi-family household, we want to make sure that everyone is counted. Decide who will fill out that form and count both families, all families. And remember, this is confidential, will not be shared with the landlord. So if your lease says you only have 6 people allowed in this apartment and you have 1 or 2 people beyond that, no worries. Will not be shared with your landlord. So if you have an occasional couch surfer, they have nowhere to be, there are options. So I talked about that homeless people, people without addresses, are hard to count because we can't get that information to them. But if they have the information, because it's an online census, they can go online at any time during the census period and fill out their census form. So for the rest of us, we'll have a household ID number on our postcard that we will put in. The person who has no address, no census ID number, will just click the check boxes to go past that. They'll click the check boxes to go past the physical address. It will then ask them if they have no address, and at that point, they can list the town, state, zip code, and a description of the physical space where they normally stay. Even if that is under the Center Avenue Bridge, that's what they put down. And they make sure they're counted. Additionally, there is what's called the homeless count, group count, between March 30th and April 1st, where people who go in for services, whether it's food bank or shelter or meal sites, will be counted there as well. That's from March 30th through April 1st. People who stay at transitory locations, such as motels, migrant worker camps, or campgrounds, there will be enumerators going out between April 9th and May 4th. Or people can fill out the form themselves using the online form. But if someone has nowhere to be and you are comfortable inviting them to your home on April 1st, you can certainly do that. And if they're staying at your house April 1st, they count on your form. So if you have questions about who to count, I mentioned there's several rules about joint custody. There's rules about students in college. There's rules about various other categories of confusing, how do I count this? On that 2020census.gov, this is the website. This is what it looks like. If you're ready to take the census, that's that blue button right in the middle of the screen. Or you can go up to the top, to the menu across the top of the screen, click on How to Respond, and then there's an option Who to Count. It will give a list of special circumstances. So those babies born close to the census day, do they count or not? Whether someone's living outside the United States on census day, people who have multiple residents, those college students, people in the military, people with no permanent address, and those children. So all of those are topics that if you go to 2020census.gov and how to respond and who to count, those are all topics that there's some really good Q&A that answers pretty much all your questions. And if you're still confused, just call that toll-free number and they can help you out. So if you want to respond in your native language, because you might be really good at English, but a government form's kind of intimidating, and this is something we really wanted to get right, up in the upper right-hand corner where it says English, you can use the pull-down menu to switch to a different language. And I mentioned there were, at this point, I think they've added some languages. There's dozens of languages to choose from. The other thing on the census website is a section on privacy and security. Now, we're giving out a whole lot of personal information here, the kind of things that we would not give out to strangers if they were not the Census Department. So we do want to make sure that the information that we are giving out is going to the census and only the census. So in that menu across the top, there's that privacy and security. And the pull-down menu, it gives a tab of an option avoiding fraud and scams. If someone's at your door saying they're from the census, how do you confirm that? If someone is calling you and saying they're from the census, well, the short answer, probably not, but you want to confirm that. How do you? You get this thing in the mail. How do you confirm it's legit? So that avoiding frauds and scams will give you some information, but the highlights are, if they ask for your Social Security number, it's not the census. The census will never ask for your Social Security number. The census will never ask for your bank account or credit card numbers. If they want financial information from you, it's not the census. They will never ask for money or donations. If they want money from you, it's not the census. They will not contact you on behalf of a political party. If there's a political party, no matter what it is, affiliated with the paperwork you have, it's not the census. They will not send your census form by email. And if you see any suspicious activities, call and report it. 1-800-923-8282. Because the census is confidential. This information cannot and will not be shared with anyone. For the first 70 years, only anonymized statistics are available. And what that means is the census, before they go through and release the data to all those decision makers and all those people who are trying to access the census numbers, the Census Department goes through and makes sure that the data cannot be picked apart to find one specific individual and tie information to that individual. And I've certainly seen as a researcher where they have done that. And as a researcher, I find it rather annoying because I have a question where someone is looking for a very small geographic area and those numbers are not available. The Census Department blocked them because the numbers alone were not confidential. I had to go to a larger geography. Instead of looking at the county level, I had to look at the state level. Or if instead of looking at the neighborhood level, I had to look at the city level. So they make sure that those numbers are anonymized. Your name information, all that personal information, name, birth date, that the genealogists want to get their hands on, that's sealed for 70 years. So the genealogists I know are getting really excited because there's a new census that's going to be coming along. It's the 1950 census, where in another 2-3 years or so, the Census Department will turn 1950 census over to the National Archives, and the National Archives will start looking for volunteers to start indexing it, and we'll be able to look up family history from 1950. The 2020 census, the one that we're doing right now, those name records are sealed and will not be released until 2092. So in 2092, your current landlord can open up and see how many people were staying in that apartment 70 years ago. I somehow think they're not going to care. We do want to fill out the census. The census is visibility, and if you are invisible, the political power structure, whether it's the government on the federal level, state level, local level, whether it's businesses, the school district, whoever, if they don't know you are there because you are invisible, they don't have to pay attention to you. The census is your chance to say, I am here and I count. So this is a quote from Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who is a member of the White Earth Band of the Ojibwe. She says, it's a radical act of saying, I have to be counted, and you have to see my community. And they have to be counted. We are here. In order to be counted, we need to respond to the 2020 census. Thank you for your time.
Wrap?